All right, anybody ever feel like an alien? Yeah, okay. I pride myself on being able to have conversations with people on just about anything, but there are limits to that, you know. And last weekend I was in Seattle, and I was traveling with my good friend Jeff Sandstrom, Dove Award-winning music producer, Jeff Sandstrom. And he really did win a Dove Award. And we were at this church at Overlake Christian Church, just outside of Seattle, Washington, a church of about 4,000 people. And we were observing their family ministry environments, and we'd done a big training session or workshop there on Saturday, and we stayed over on Sunday to observe all their environments. And Jeff instantly gravitates towards the back of the room, because in the back of the room is where the soundboard is. And so Jeff is back there looking at the soundboard, kind of looking over their shoulders at all the technology that they have and all the technology that they're missing. And one of the guys who's running the soundboard turns to him and says, "Oh, you know, what do you think?" And they're talking about this and that, and they start throwing out terminology that it was as if they were speaking in numbers. I remember when we had one of those, but now we've got one of these. Oh, that one, and that one does so many presets and makes the colors, and I'm thinking, colors? This is sound. What are you talking about? And I felt like an alien, because everyone around me understood that language. All those little and I looked at them and I said, "You're all nerds," and I ran away. Sometimes I feel like an alien. I grew up. I was adopted, but my mother is first-generation Mexican-American, and so that whole side of my family is all Hispanic, and they're fairly dark-complected. And I would go to San Diego for family get-togethers, family gatherings, and they would all start speaking Spanish, and I would just sit in the corner, nobody, because I couldn't speak Spanish, and my uncles even developed a nickname for me. My uncles called me, and still to this day call me the White Tortilla. I would go to San Diego and just feel like an alien. You ever feel like an alien? There's a story. Karen Smith is a kindergarten teacher just outside of Chicago, and she's originally from England. And she teaches kindergarten in a Christian school. And a couple of years ago, around the election time, she was in her kindergarten class, and they were talking about the election. And all the kids asked Miss Karen who she voted for. And she said, "Well, Miss Karen didn't vote." "Well, why not?" "Is it because you're so old?" one of the students asked. "And is it because you don't like them? Or why is it?" And she said, "It's because I'm from England, and people from England can't vote to see who's going to be the president of the United States. In fact, what they call me is a resident alien." That's what they call people who are from another country. And it's interesting what sticks in the heads of kids, because later that afternoon they were having prayer time in their classroom, and one of the kindergartners said, "And dear God, please help people from stop being so mean to Miss Karen and calling her an alien." There are movies and TV shows. Remember My Favorite Martian and Third Rock from the Sun and E.T. and all these movies. So many movies and television shows about being an alien. And I think one of the reasons why is because it resonates with something deep within all of us. There are times when we all feel like aliens in this culture, in the world where we live. We recognize just how bizarre the world is and how little we fit in to it. And we feel like aliens. And a common theme in all those movies is that you kind of have to pretend to be normal and not let anyone else know that you feel this way or that you don't really know what you're doing. But it resonates deep within all of us. We feel, to some extent, as if we're aliens. And the Bible actually confirms that. In fact, in 1 Peter 2, it calls Christians aliens. It says we live like aliens in a foreign land. The Bible says that. And that says something about the way we're supposed to live, to acknowledge the fact that the culture in which we find ourselves is very different from who we are. And that the culture in which we live should not define who we are or determine how we're supposed to live. And this is why the story of Daniel is so important for us. I was thinking about this earlier today, and I wrote about this on my blog, and I was just talking about it with Sherry. When you think of Old Testament characters and great Old Testament heroes, our minds instantly go, there are a few that just automatically pop up. Abraham, Moses, David. After a few seconds reflection, we might think of Joseph, Joshua, Gideon. There are some women, Ruth, Esther, Deborah. I think of all of them, the most underrated is probably Daniel. I couldn't think of a popular level book written on the life of Daniel. There are all kinds of books written on Joseph and David and Solomon and all these, but Daniel kind of gets overlooked. But the reason why his story is so important for us is because it speaks to how we're supposed to live as alien people in a foreign culture. So open up to Daniel chapter 1, and that's where we're going to spend time tonight. I'm going to read the whole chapter, and then we'll kind of look at this story here in Daniel chapter 1. It begins this way. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Remember, Jehoiakim was Josiah's son, and he didn't reign very long or very well. So in the 3rd year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Remember, we talked about one of the things they would do was they would take some of the ruling class away from the hometown so that the people would be less inclined to rise up in rebellion. Young men, verse 4, without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and wine, and they were given, and the wine they were given to drink, and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom, and Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. All right. You got to begin this whole series that we're going to embark upon here with this understanding. Daniel never expected he was going to end up in Babylon. He never imagined that this is where he was going to live and die. And Daniel does. He dies there. He never goes home. He lives about 65, 70 years in a foreign land, And he never anticipated that this would be where he would end up. He would have imagined, I mean, you look back to verse 3. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. So Daniel comes from a very affluent, kind of high society family. He's got social status. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He's got it all. He's physically fit, he's attractive, he's got status, he's smart, he's got people skills. He is the total package. And one of the reasons why I think we shy away from his story is because he's kind of a golden boy. We like our heroes to have a little, we want there to be some kind of a tragic flaw in them. And there's no moral failure in Daniel's life like there is in David or in Abraham or in Moses. There's none of that going on here. One of the things I love about this story, though, is a lot of times we get the impression that God only uses the people who have messed up. That God only uses the mutts and the rejects. And we kind of have this kind of reverse discrimination, And I've known people who kind of grew up in the church and never really did all the really bad stuff. I've known people to make up bad stuff that they did in college just so that they could kind of have a testimony that sounded like everybody else's. Because for some people, becoming a Christian was just like, hey, you want to become a Christian? No, okay. And they'd never really done anything. I know Christians who've never been drunk, who've never committed adultery or never immorality or, never really did all this super bad stuff that we tend to identify with people that God uses in mighty ways, and they feel like, well, gypped, What can God still use me? And Daniel is an example of a guy who gets it. He's a golden boy. Now, when he's growing up, he must have thought about what his life was going to be. I mean, he must have thought his life was set. He comes from good stock, good, believing parents, God-fearing parents who have raised him the right way, who have been diligent about the kind of home environment that they wanted to create for him. And he must have thought, okay, I'm going to go to school, and then when I graduate school, I'll get a good job, and eventually I'll find a wife, and we'll settle down, and we'll have some kids, and maybe I'll run for office or something like that, and God's going to use me in these big, big ways. That must have been what he thought his life was going to be like. And all of a sudden, his life takes a radical turn. A 700-mile detour. It's like, imagine Daniel as a teenager, because he would have been a teenager. He's sitting in his, sophomore English class, and all of a sudden soldiers show up and drag the AP English class away and march them 700 miles to a different place, and nobody can do anything about it. That's kind of what happens to him. And he loses everything in the process. His status, and he loses his culture, and he even loses his name. Look at verse 7. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. And this is a more important thing than we give credence to. All four of those names in their original names have reference to God in them. Either in the two letters E-L-L, which would have meant Lord, or in Yah, Y-A-H, which would have meant God, as in Yahweh. So you look at those four names, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They all have reference to God. Their names, their very identity is established by who their God is. And now, Daniel's given a new name. And Bel, B-E-L, is the name of one of the Babylonian gods. And Nego is another name for one of the Babylonian gods. So they're losing their culture here. Look at how they're educated. The end of verse 5. The end of verse 4. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. You know, sometimes Christians get all hung up over the fact that Harry Potter is taught in public schools here. You know, this would have made your head explode. You know, I mean, the stuff that they would have been taught, it would have really, really undercut what they had learned when they were growing up in Israel. Daniel's name means the Lord will judge, or the Lord is my judge. So every time anyone called him by that name, it was a reminder that God was going to see that justice is done, that God will set things right. Anytime somebody even mentioned his name, it would have been a reminder that God is in control and that ultimately God is going to make sure that justice is served. But now this new king is asserting himself. And he's saying to them, let me define who you are. But it's interesting how he does it, though. Look at the end of verse 4. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. In verse 5, the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. Now, it's interesting because as they're marching 700 miles, you gotta imagine the conversation that they were having. What do you think they're going to do? I don't know, man, but it probably isn't going to be good. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar is not a nice guy. Nebuchadnezzar is the guy, remember, I think last week or the week before, we talked about Zedekiah, the last king, and what Nebuchadnezzar does to him, has all of his sons marched out in front of him and kills all of his sons and then plucks his eyes out so that the last thing he sees is the murder of his sons. That's the kind of guy Nebuchadnezzar is. So they've got to be thinking, what do you think he's going to do? I don't know, but it's probably not going to be good. Do you think he's going to torture us? Yeah, he might probably torture us, or maybe put us to work and doing hard labor, stuff like that. But he doesn't. Instead, he invites them in. Hey, guys, I've been waiting for you. I got food here. This is going to be great. You guys are going to love it. Here, I just want you to know how glad I am for you to be here, and I want to do everything I can to set you up to win. I know you're a long ways from home, and I know that trip had to have been really, really disconcerting, but I want you to know that I'm rooting for you. I'm on your side. Anything you need, you let my stewards know. We've got food, we got wine, we're going to educate you. We're going to put you on a fast track to leadership. This is going to be great. No prison, no torture, no abuse. Instead, he just treats them so well. Why do you suppose he does that? If you think about it, you can kind of contrast the way Nebuchadnezzar approaches them with the way Pharaoh approaches them. Remember Pharaoh? Pharaoh approaches the Israelites with abuse, and Nebuchadnezzar approaches them with kindness. Pharaoh says, I'm going to beat the belief out of them. And Nebuchadnezzar says, I'm going to instill new beliefs in them. Pharaoh says, we need to destroy the distinctives of their faith. And Nebuchadnezzar says, we'll just absorb them into our culture. This is a much more subtle approach that Nebuchadnezzar takes. But we see it in our own day in foreign countries. When the government cracks down on Christians and says, you may not share the gospel with other people, what tends to happen? They share it with other people, exactly. Even at the cost of their own lives, even though they're threatened with being put in prison or being tortured, that only bolsters their faith. Instead, Nebuchadnezzar comes along and says, here's what I want to portray. I want to give you the idea that the king is the greatest guy in the world and that the palace is the place to be. And I'll just sort of absorb them into our culture. Now look at verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. Something happens in Daniel. Daniel says, my name is Daniel. My identity is defined by someone else. And I cannot, and I will not, forget who I am. And he refuses to be seduced by the culture around him. Refuses to be hypnotized by all the shiny stuff and all the fatty foods and all the good wine. He says, I'm going to see through all that to the God who calls me to honor him in everything I do. It's Daniel versus culture. Daniel deciding, I'm an alien and I'm not going to pretend like I'm not an alien. See, in all those movies and all those books and all those television shows, the big thing is no one may ever find out that I'm an alien. Daniel says, I'm an alien and I'm going to let everybody know. I don't belong here. And that's how he's going to live. It's interesting. Researchers have studied POWs, prisoners of war. And there's been a lot of research done in recent years, especially people who survived POW camps in Korea and Vietnam. They studied the 52 hostages that were held in Iran. They've studied these people who have endured hostage situations. And they can neatly categorize them. There are two categories of survivors. There are people who are just destroyed by their experience. Their spirit just withers. They have nervous breakdowns. They never recover. And then there are people, oddly enough, who actually come out of their experience stronger than they went into it. And this has baffled researchers. How is it that one group of people go into these circumstances and just unravel, and other people come out of the same circumstances stronger than they went in? And they've termed this group of people resilient. That's the term that researchers use to describe those people. These are people of resilience. Resilience is the ability to thrive while enduring hardship. Somehow or other, these people were able to grow. And there are certain characteristics of resilient people. And we see 3 of them in this first chapter in the life of Daniel. So I want to walk you through this, and we're going to look at 3 examples, 3 characteristics of resilient people. And this will help us live as resident aliens. The first one is resilient people live lives of integrity. They determine what their core values are, and they refuse to compromise on those core values. Verse 8, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself. Now, it's interesting. This is kind of the hinge of the whole book of Daniel. Because up until this time, who's been making all the decisions? The Babylonians. The Babylonians have decided to go and besiege the city of Jerusalem. And the Babylonians decided that they were going to take some of the things out of Jerusalem, out of the temple, and take them back to Babylon. And the Babylonians decided who they were going to round up and where they were going to put them and where to enroll them in school and what to name them. The Babylonians had been making all the decisions until verse 8. Now, all of a sudden, Daniel makes a decision. And Daniel, the prisoner, makes a decision. See, Daniel could have remained passive. He could have chosen to be a victim. Well, I can't really help it because, I'm not really in control here, and so I'm just doing what they're telling me to do. They're forcing me to do this. My hands are literally tied here. But instead, Daniel says, there are some things I can control. And even if all I can control is what goes in my mouth and what comes out of my mouth, I'll start there. Daniel makes a choice. It's interesting, if you look at verse 7, you see in verse 7 where it says the chief official gave them new names. Literally in the Hebrew, it means the chief official determined new names for them. And in verse 8 where it says Daniel resolved not to defile himself, it's the same word. Determined, Daniel determined. So it literally reads that the chief official determined new names for them, but Daniel determined not to defile himself. So it's the same word, and it's a very, very strong word. Daniel makes a decision. In life, there are some things you can control, and there are some things that are absolutely out of your control. What goes in your mouth and what comes out of your mouth is a good place for you to start. And people of integrity are marked by these kind of core values that they determine they're going to live by. And again, this is not an easy choice for Daniel because Nebuchadnezzar has a reputation for being a cruel and violent man. But he goes to the chief official, verse 10. He goes to the chief official, and he says, hey, I'm not going to do this. And the official says to Daniel, I'm afraid of the king who has assigned your food and drink, that he's going to see you looking weaker than the others, and then he's going to kill me. And it's interesting because Daniel is very, very shrewd. You notice that the chief official doesn't really say no. I mean, he doesn't say yes or no. He just says, I have concerns about that. So Daniel says, well, that sounds like a yes to me. And so in verse 11, you notice he doesn't go to the chief official again. He goes to the guy next down on the org chart. He goes to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel. And so it's very, very shrewd. It takes amazing initiative. And he says to the guard, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. And so this is amazing courage and initiative and boldness. He's really, really trusting that God's going to come through here. And it works. Look down at verse 15. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them the veggie platter. So Daniel resolved, I am going to live a certain way. Now, here's a question. Would it have been wrong to eat the king's food? Would it have been wrong? There's nothing to say that it's wrong. Now, some people say, well, it would have violated Jewish dietary laws, but we don't know that from the text. Some people have said, well, it was probably that the meat that they were eating had been sacrificed to idols. We don't know that. I mean, I've heard that. I read that in commentaries. You know, that some people say, well, there's got to be a reason why Daniel would have felt. Well, we don't know that. Now, a lot of times, this is where we get hung up, and this is where we get, kind of different from a lot of people in Scripture. We're concerned with whether it would be right or wrong to eat the king's meat and drink the king's wine. Is that right or wrong? Is it right or wrong to drink wine? Anybody willing to say, I know for certain on that? It's hard to say, isn't it? Is it right or wrong to eat this food or drink this wine and not that wine? If it's right or wrong, that's what we want to be concerned with. Daniel is concerned with something much deeper than whether something is right or wrong. Daniel is saying, what is wise? What's the wise thing here? See, Daniel could have gone along, but Daniel said somewhere along the line, I'm going to need some boundaries in my life. I'm going to have to draw, because wisdom says, a man with no boundaries is like a city whose walls have fallen down. So I have to have some boundaries. Nobody is going to enforce these boundaries externally. I need to have these boundaries set by me. And so I'm going to determine what's wise and what's not wise, and how far and how long and what not. See, if you're just concerned with, okay, is it right or wrong to see that kind of movie? If you're just concerned with right or wrong and rules on stuff, you're going to have to generate rules for every single issue in your life. And this is really important for parents, okay? If you're raising your kids to be only concerned with what's right and what's wrong, you're going to have to tell them what's right and what's wrong for every single decision for the rest of their lives. And there are some decisions that, how much debt is too much debt? Is it right or wrong to date that person? Is it right or wrong to go to that college, to major in that field, to take that job, to move to that city? See, is it right or wrong doesn't answer all the questions that we have to face. And what our kids need and what we need as we try to navigate through life is not the determination that this is right and that's wrong, but to ask ourselves, what is wise? Is it wise to go to that movie? Under some circumstances, yes. Under other circumstances, no. Is it wise to listen to that kind of music for that long? Is it wise to watch this much? How much television is it wise to watch? Is it wise to read those magazines or this kind of literature? See, this is a whole different kind of question now, isn't it? Now instead of being determined how far, how close, because this is the other thing. If I tell you it is wrong to stand on this chair, well, how about if I lean on the chair? Can I lean on the chair? How about if I just put one leg up on the chair? I'm not standing on the chair. See, I have kids. I know this. I know how this works. Okay? I'm not standing on the chair. You said it was wrong to stand on the chair. See, you're going to have to say it's wrong to have both feet on the chair. See? So you got to, okay, now I only have one foot on the chair. Is it wrong now? See, if you frame the question differently and get your kids and you thinking not about what's right and what's wrong, but about what's wise, that helps us now. Especially when we're trying to live as aliens in a foreign land. Because it's not always about what's right and wrong. Sometimes it's about what's wise. And you have choices. You're not helpless in this. You're not always a victim of your circumstances. You have choices. You have options. And you can decide, I'm going to do what's wise. We live in Babylon, okay? We're all Daniel, and we all live in Babylon, in a foreign culture that attempts to seduce us into abandoning our identity and living the way everybody else does. But Daniel established a pattern here. He made a determination, a decision. He resolved that he was going to set some boundaries in his life, and he established a pattern. And it was very important for him to establish this pattern early on, because later on in his life, as we'll see in the coming weeks, Daniel has some tough decisions to make. Because at some point in time, they come to his three friends and they say, you have to bow down and worship an idol of the king. And they say, we're not going to do that. If you don't do it, we're going to throw you in the fire. And they have a tough decision to make. Later they'll come to Daniel and they'll say, Daniel, you cannot pray to your God. Well, I'm going to pray to my God, but if you do that, we're going to throw you in a den full of lions. And Daniel has to decide, who determines my boundaries? Who sets the pattern for how I'm going to live? And because Daniel makes this decision now, I wonder, would he have been able to withstand the pressure later in his life if he'd compromised now? That's why it's so important to set these things, set these patterns early in life. And you have to make a choice. Who defines your identity? And who determines how you are going to live? Is it going to be the culture around you? Or is it going to be the God who promises to one day set everything right? The second thing we learn about resilient people. First, resilient people live lives of integrity. They decide what their core values are and they live them out. The second thing about resilient people is resilient people live in community. You look at Daniel here in the very first chapter, and he's got these three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they go to school together, they eat together, they fast together, they probably prayed together. Later on, they'll rule together. These four guys significantly impacted the direction of this nation. And because of these four guys, the thread of God's people continued even when it looked like the light had gone out. These four guys made a pact that they're going to go through life together. And this is just the truth. In Babylon, you will not survive on your own. You have to have friends. You have to have people around you who believe the same kinds of things you believe, who can hold your arms up when you're too tired, who can encourage you, who can challenge you, who can lift you up when you're too tired to go on your own. You have to have community if you're going to survive in this foreign land. Vice Admiral James Stockdale served 2,714 days as a prisoner of war in Vietnam. 2,714 days. And these people who have studied POWs have spent a lot of time studying the group of people that Stockdale served with. And one day, one of the things that they would do in this prison camp is they would subject them to sleep deprivation. So they'd try to keep them awake. And one of the things they would do is when you would fall asleep, they'd beat you, wake you up to make sure you couldn't fall asleep. And one day he's enduring this out in the blistering sun, and he hears tapping. And he recognizes Morse code. And they're tapping out 5 letters. And it's a bunch of soldiers in unison tapping out these 5 letters. G-B-U-J-S. God bless you, Jim Stockdale. They just tapped those 5 letters out over and over again. And they developed all kinds of codes for the way they would drag their sandals. The way they would... these are guys, and they were living in rough conditions, and so bodily functions and things like that, they figured out codes for everything that would communicate, because they were not allowed to talk to one another, so they figured out other ways that they could communicate to build camaraderie. And he says that just hearing those 5 letters tapped out over and over again, God bless you, Jim Stockdale, God bless you, Jim Stockdale, were what kept him from going insane. They were the things that kept him alive. And what I find most amazing is that in a situation like that, where community is forbidden, people will move heaven and earth to see that it thrives. And yet, in a society like ours, where it should be so easy for us to build community, we avoid it at all costs. When you desperately need it, you will go to any lengths to make sure that there is one person out there tapping out your initials. And yet, we sit in rooms like this every day, and I guarantee you there's at least one person in this room who feels isolated and alone most of the time. What would it be like if the people in this room determined that no one goes through life alone? That everybody here needs to hear somebody tapping out their initials at the end of that phrase. God bless you. I'm glad you're here. Don't you give up. I'm here for you. What if everybody in this room made the decision to seek out somebody who looked like they desperately needed someone to reassure them, and made sure that no one goes through life alone? People come to me with problems sometimes. Oh, John, I got this decision to make. It's really hard, and I don't know what to do. Or I'm struggling with my kids or with my marriage. Or we're agonizing over whether to take this new job or whether to move over here or whatever. And they want my advice. You know, I'm on the road a lot. I travel a lot of different places, and I can't tell you the Friday night conversations I have with pastors and preachers and elders and whatever. Oh, you know, the stuff that I hear is just ridiculous. The decisions people are trying to make. And they want my advice. Total stranger. They want my advice. And my first question to them is always, are you in community? Do you have a group of people that you do life with? Have you shared this with them? And the excuses I get, no, I tried that once and it didn't work, or well, you try it again. Because you live in Babylon, and you will not survive on your own. We aliens have to stick together. And Daniel makes that decision early on. I'm not going to survive in isolation. I need to hear somebody say, God bless you, Daniel. I'm glad you're here. Don't you give up. Resilient people live lives of integrity, and resilient people live lives in community. And here's the third thing. Resilient people understand that life, even suffering, has meaning and purpose if there really is a God. if there really is a God, then everything that happens in life has meaning and purpose. People who have studied prisoners of war and people in war camps have noted, and if you've ever read Viktor Frankl's Man in Search of Meaning or some of those books, it's a great documentation of how people can endure anything except the idea that they're suffering with no purpose. People can endure hardship and depravity. People can endure miserable conditions and the loss of life and limb. The one thing they cannot endure is the idea that what they're doing has no purpose. Resilient people understand. If you look at, go back to Daniel chapter 1, 3 verses. Verse 2 says, "And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand." Verse 9, "Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel." Verse 17, "To these 4 young men God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning." Do you see this? There's a character who's just below the surface. You think the story is about Daniel, but there's this character behind the scenes who's at work from the very beginning. God delivered the city into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. And God allowed that official to look on Daniel with favor. And God gave them wisdom and understanding of all kinds. God is at work behind the scenes. None of the events that we've read about in chapter 1, none of these events is meaningless or purposeless. Everything has meaning and purpose. God is up to something even in Babylon. God is still present. God has not fallen asleep. God has not abandoned His promises. God has not abandoned His people. God is at work even in the midst of a hardship and despair. God is up to something, even though we don't always understand it. I have a very good friend, and his name is John Dobbs. And John Dobbs preaches for a church in Pascagoula, Mississippi. And I talked to John on the phone today, and I'm going to talk to him tomorrow too, because we do a monthly recording, I've mentioned this before, that goes out to about 10,000 households every month. And one of the pieces of that monthly CD is a phone call conversation, and we always try to talk to someone who we find who exemplifies the monthly virtue that we're trying to get across to households. And the monthly virtue for the month of April will be hope. And we've defined hope as believing something good can come out of something bad. And you can only believe that, by the way, if you understand that there really is a God. Okay? And so we're going to interview John Dobbs. I was talking to him a little bit about this today. John Dobbs in Pascagoula, Mississippi. I went back, he has a blog, and I was reading some of the entries from the end of August and the beginning of September, when John's life was turned upside down. Because Pascagoula, Mississippi was right in the middle of Katrina, when Hurricane Katrina hit land. And John preaches for a church that their church, you're bigger than his church, you know. He had about 85, 95 people on any given Sunday, and his church was flooded, 4 feet of water. He lost everything. He said a way to think about it is to go through your house with your hands at waist level and realize everything below your hands would be gone. He lost his vehicle. He lost his house. He lost his church. He lost everything. He was just devastated. Didn't know what to do. Couldn't stop crying. Couldn't stop thinking about the people in his neighborhood. 14,000 homes in his city were lost, gone forever. And John Dobbs was, at the time, a little bit adrift. Before Katrina hit, he was thinking, is this all there is? I've been here for a long time, and I love these people, but we're not growing, and we're kind of stagnant. And I'm pouring my heart into these people, and I just wonder, is anything really happening? Is this all there is? Is it just going to be more of this between now and the day I die? Is this all there is? And after Katrina, and after the shock kind of wore off, John decided to roll up his sleeves. And it forced him to change the way he did ministry. Because there was no office to go to. And so, when John told me he knocked on 108 doors yesterday and just asked people, what do you need? Because we got stuff back at our church building. What can I bring you something? Do you need water? Do you need a mattress? What do you need? Knocked on 108 people's doors yesterday just to say, how can I help you? How can I serve you? This has radically altered this guy's life. What could have been seen as just devastating meaninglessness, so many people now look at that and think, what good could ever come out of something that tragic? John Dobbs will tell you. John Dobbs will tell you about hundreds of churches of various stripes and sizes and colors and denominations who have come together, pooled their resources, rolled up their sleeves and said, we're rebuilding our community. People he never would have come in contact with before. People he never would have thought of talking or seeking out. Now he sits with people. People who are older than he is, people who are younger than he is, widows, orphans, people who are lost, people who are found, people who come from states all over the country. And John Dobbs' ministry, his life, is totally changed. And he knows now nothing is meaningless if there really is a God. God was with Daniel, even in Babylon. Even though he'd been taken hundreds of miles away from his home and stripped of his status and stripped of his everything, God was with him. And God is with you in the midst of your Babylon, too. When life doesn't turn out the way you thought it was going to turn out. When you find yourself in a place and you say, how did I get here? I don't belong here. This isn't my life. These aren't the kids I was supposed to have, and that's not the house I was supposed to live in, and this isn't the career I thought I was going to pursue when I was in college and I had these great dreams. How did I end up here? God's with you even there. And what if we decided that we were going to live as if that were true? What would it look like for the people in this room to say, no matter what circumstances life throws at me, I am going to live as if there really is a God who infuses every single event in my life with meaning and purpose, who is guiding the circumstances of my life to a place where He has predetermined to take me. What if we really lived like that? Do you think this would be the kind of group that people would want to hang around with? Do you think we could keep them out? Do you think maybe we would have to move into the big room? Wouldn't that be great? If there's a group of people somewhere in the city of Atlanta who really lives as if there's a God who is on the loose and active in unpredictable sort of ways, that's the kind of group I want to be a part of. That's the kind of group I want God to build us into. Let's pray. God, we believe. We believe that you really are alive and active. That you did not retire 2,000 years ago to rest on your laurels, but that you continue to move throughout your world, seeking people whose hearts are devoted to you. And God, we want to be those people. We want to be people who live lives of integrity. We want to be people who live life in community. And we want to be people who are characterized by a sense of purpose and mission and meaning as we understand that your will is gradually unfolding in our midst. God, we pray that we will be your instruments to further the borders of your kingdom and accomplish your works in our generation. Help us to live the kinds of courageous lifestyle that Daniel lived as aliens in a foreign culture. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.